Part the Second. 1. Many a weary year had passed since the burning of Grand Prix, when on the falling tide the freighted vessels departed, bearing the nation, with all its household gods, into exile. Exile without an end, and without an example in story. Far asunder, on separate coasts, the Acadians landed. Scattered were they, like flakes of snow, when the wind from the northeast strikes aslant through the fogs that darken the banks of Newfoundland. Friendless, homeless, hopeless, they wandered from city to city, from the cold lakes of the north to sultry southern savannas, from the bleak shores of the sea to the lands where the Father of Waters seizes the hills in his hands, and drags them down to the ocean, deep in their sands to bury the scattered bones of the mammoth. Friends they sought and homes, and many, despairing, heartbroken, asked of the earth but a grave, and no longer a friend nor a fireside. Written their history stands on tablets of stone in the churchyards. Long among them was seen a maiden who waited and wandered, lowly and meek in spirit, and patiently suffering all things. Fair was she and young, but, alas, before her extended, dreary and vast and silent, the desert of life, with its pathway marked by the graves of those who had sorrowed and suffered before her, passions long extinguished, and hopes long dead and abandoned, as the emigrant's way o'er the western desert is marked by campfires long consumed, and bones that bleach in the sunshine. Something there was in her life incomplete, imperfect, unfinished, as if a morning of June, with all its music and sunshine, suddenly paused in the sky, and, fading, slowly descended into the east again, from whence it late had arisen. Sometimes she lingered in towns, till, urged by the fever within her, urged by a restless longing, the hunger and thirst of the spirit, she would commence again her endless search and endeavor. Sometimes in churchyards strayed, and gazed on the crosses and tombstones, sat by some nameless grave, and thought that perhaps in its bosom he was already at rest, and she longed to slumber beside him. Sometimes a rumor, a hearsay, an inarticulate whisper, came with its airy hand to point and beckon her forward. Sometimes she spake with those who had seen her beloved and known him, but it was long ago, in some far-off place or forgotten. Gabriel la Jeunesse, they said. Yes, we have seen him. He was with Basil the blacksmith, and both have gone to the prairies. Coureurs de bois are they, and famous hunters and trappers. Gabriel la Jeunesse, said others. Oh yes, we have seen him. He is a voyageur in the lowlands of Louisiana. Then would they say, dear child, why dream and wait for him longer? Are there not other youths as fair as Gabriel? Others who have hearts as tender and true, and spirits as loyal? Here is Baptiste Leblanc, the notary's son, who has loved thee many a tedious year. Come, give him thy hand and be happy. Thou art too fair to be left to braid St. Catherine's tresses. Then would Evangeline answer, serenely but sadly, I cannot. Whither my heart has gone, there follows my hand, and not elsewhere. For when the heart goes before, like a lamp, and illumines the pathway, many things are made clear that else lie hidden in darkness. Thereupon the priest, her friend and father confessor, said, with a smile, O daughter, thy God thus speaketh within thee. Talk not of wasted affection. Affection never was wasted. If it enrich not the heart of another, its waters, returning back to their springs, like the rain, shall fill them full of refreshment. That which the fountain sends forth returns again to the fountain. Patience, accomplish thy labor, accomplish thy work of affection. Sorrow and silence are strong, and patient endurance is godlike. Therefore accomplish thy labor of love, till the heart is made godlike, purified, strengthened, perfected, and rendered more worthy of heaven. Cheered by the good man's words, Evangeline labored and waited. Still in her heart she heard the funeral dirge of the ocean, but with its sound there was mingled a voice that whispered, Despair not. Thus did that poor soul wander in want and cheerless discomfort, bleeding, barefooted, over the shards and thorns of existence. Let me essay, O Muse, to follow the wanderer's footsteps, not through each devious path, each changeful year of existence, but as a traveler follows a streamlet's course through the valley, far from its margin at times, and seeing the gleam of its water here and there in some open space, and at intervals only, then drawing nearer its banks, through sylvan glooms that conceal it. Though he behold it not, he can hear its continuous murmur, happy, at length, if he finds the spot where it reaches an outlet. 2. It was the month of May. Far down the beautiful river, past the Ohio shore and past the mouth of the Wabash, into the golden stream of the broad and swift Mississippi, floated a cumbrous boat that was rowed by Acadian boatmen. It was a band of exiles, a raft, as it were, from the shipwrecked nation, scattered along the coast, now floating together, bound by the bonds of a common belief and a common misfortune, men and women and children, who, guided by hope or by hearsay, sought for their kith and their kin among the philanthropic farmers on the Acadian coast and the prairies of fair Opelousas. With them Evangeline went and her guide, the Father Felician, onward o'er sunken sands, through a wilderness somber with forests. Day after day they glided adown the turbulent river, night after night, by their blazing fires, encamped on its borders, now through rushing chutes, among green islands, where plume-like cotton trees nodded their shadowy crests. They swept with the current, then emerged into broad lagoons, where silvery sandbars lay in the stream, and along the wimpling waves of their margin, shining with snow-white plumes, large flocks of pelicans waded. Level the landscape grew, and along the shores of the river, shaded by china trees, in the midst of luxuriant gardens, stood the houses of planters, with negro cabins and dove-cots. They were approaching the region where reigns perpetual summer, where through the golden coast and groves of orange and citron sweeps with majestic curve the river away to the eastward. They, too, swerved from their course, and, entering the bayou of Plaquemine, soon were lost in a maze of sluggish and devious waters, which, like a network of steel, extended in every direction. Over their heads the towering and tenebrous boughs of the cypress met in a dusky arch, and trailing mosses in mid-air waved like banners that hang on the walls of ancient cathedrals. Death-like the silence seemed, and unbroken, save by the herons home to their roasts in the cedar trees returning at sunset, or by the owl as he greeted the moon with demoniac laughter. Lovely the moonlight was as it glanced and gleamed on the water, gleamed on the columns of cypress and cedar sustaining the arches, down through whose broken vaults it fell as through chinks in a ruin. Dreamlike and indistinct and strange were all things around them, and o'er their spirits there came a feeling of wonder and sadness, strange forebodings of ill unseen and that cannot be compassed, as, at the tramp of a horse's hoof on the turf of the prairies, far in advance are closed the leaves of the shrinking mimosa, so, at the hoof-beats of fate, with sad forebodings of evil, shrinks and closes the heart ere the stroke of doom has attained it. But Evangeline's heart was sustained by a vision that faintly floated before her eyes and beckoned her on through the moonlight. It was the thought of her brain that assumed the shape of a phantom. Through those shadowy aisles had Gabriel wandered before her, and every stroke of the oar now brought him nearer and nearer. Then in his place, at the prow of the boat, rose one of the oarsmen, and, as a signal sound, if others like them peradventure sailed on those gloomy and midnight streams, blew a blast on his bugle, while through the dark colonnades and corridors leafy the blast rang, breaking the seal of silence, and giving tongues to the forest. Soundless above them the banners of moss just stirred to the music. Multitudinous echoes awoke and died in the distance, over the watery floor and beneath the reverberant branches, but not a voice replied. No answer came from the darkness, and, when the echoes had ceased, like a sense of pain was the silence. Then Evangeline slept, but the boatmen rowed through the midnight, silent at times, then singing familiar Canadian boat songs, such as they sang of old on their own Acadian rivers, while through the night were heard the mysterious sounds of the desert, far off, indistinct, as of wave or wind in the forest, mixed with the whoop of the crane and the roar of the grim alligator. Thus ere another noon they emerged from the shades, and before them lay in the golden sun the lakes of the Atchafalaya. Water lilies in myriads rocked on the slight undulations made by the passing oars, and, resplendent in beauty, the lotus lifted her golden crown above the heads of the boatmen. Faint was the air with the odorous breath of magnolia blossoms, and with the heat of noon, and numberless sylvan islands, fragrant and thickly embowered with blossoming hedges of roses, near to whose shores they glided along, and invited to slumber. Soon by the fairest of these their weary oars were suspended. Under the boughs of wachita willows that grew by the margin, safely their boat was moored, and scattered about on the greensward, tired with their midnight toil, the weary travelers slumbered. Over them vast and high extended the cope of a cedar, swinging from its great arms. The trumpet flower and the grapevine hung their ladder of ropes aloft like the ladder of Jacob, on whose pendulous stairs the angels ascending, descending, were the swift humming birds that flitted from blossom to blossom. Such was the vision Evangeline saw as she slumbered beneath it. Filled was her heart with love, and the dawn of an opening heaven lighted her soul in sleep with the glory of regions celestial. Nearer, ever nearer, among the numberless islands, darted a light, swift boat that sped away o'er the water, urged on its course by the sinewy arms of hunters and trappers. Northward its prow was turned, to the land of the bison and beaver. At the helm sat a youth, with countenance thoughtful and careworn. Dark and neglected locks overshadowed his brow, and a sadness somewhat beyond his years on his face was legibly written. Gabriel was it, who, weary with waiting, unhappy and restless, sought in the western wilds oblivion of self and of sorrow. Swiftly they glided along, close under the lee of the island, but by the opposite bank, and behind a screen of palmettos, so that they saw not the boat where it lay concealed in the willows. All undisturbed by the dash of their oars, and unseen, were the sleepers. Angel of God was there none to awaken the slumbering maiden. Swiftly they glided away, like the shade of a cloud on the prairie, after the sound of their oars on the tholes had died in the distance. As from a magic trance the sleepers awoke, and the maiden said with a sigh to the friendly priest, "O Father Felician, something says in my heart that near me Gabriel wanders. Is it a foolish dream, an idle and vague superstition, or has an angel passed and revealed the truth to my spirit?" Then, with a blush, she added, "Alas for my credulous fancy, unto ears like thine such words as these have no meaning." But made answer the reverend man, and he smiled as he answered, "Daughter, thy words are not idle, nor are they to me without meaning. Feeling is deep and still, and the word that floats on the surface is as the tossing buoy that betrays where the anchor is hidden. Therefore trust to thy heart, and to what the world calls illusions. Gabriel truly is near thee, for not far away to the southward, on the banks of the Tech, are the towns of St. Maur and St. Martin. There the long-wandering bride shall be given again to her bridegroom. There the long-absent pastor regained his flock and his sheepfold. Beautiful is the land, with its prairies and forests of fruit trees, under the feet a garden of flowers, and the bluest of heavens bending above, and resting its dome on the walls of the forest. They who dwell there have named it the Eden of Louisiana. With these words of cheer they arose and continued their journey. Softly the evening came. The sun from the western horizon like a magician extended his golden wand o'er the landscape. Twinkling vapors arose, and sky and water and forest seemed all on fire at the touch, and melted and mingled together. Hanging between two skies, a cloud with edges of silver, floated the boat with its dripping oars on the motionless water. Filled was Evangeline's heart with inexpressible sweetness. Touched by the magic spell, the sacred fountains of feeling glowed with the light of love, as the skies and waters around her. Then from a neighboring thicket the mockingbird, wildest of singers, swinging aloft on the willow spray that hung o'er the water, shook from his little throat such floods of delirious music that the whole air and the woods and the waves seemed silent to listen. Plaintive at first were the tones and sad, then soaring to madness seemed they to follow or guide the revel of frenzied bacchantes. Single notes were then heard, in sorrowful, low lamentation, till, having gathered them all, he flung them abroad in derision, as when, after a storm, a gust of wind through the tree-tops shakes down the rattling rain in a crystal shower on the branches. With such a prelude as this, and hearts that throbbed with emotion, slowly they entered the Tech, where it flows through the green Opelousas, and, through the amber air, above the crest of the woodland, saw the column of smoke that arose from a neighboring dwelling. Sounds of a horn they heard, and the distant lowing of cattle. 3. near to the bank of the river, overshadowed by oaks, from whose branches garlands of Spanish moss and of mystic mistletoe flaunted, such as the Druids cut down with golden hatchets at Yuletide, stood, secluded and still, the house of the herdsman. A garden girded it round about with a belt of luxuriant blossoms, filling the air with fragrance. The house itself was of timbers hewn from the cypress tree and carefully fitted together. Large and low was the roof, and on slender columns supported, rose-wreathed, vine-encircled, a broad and spacious veranda, haunt of the hummingbird and the bee, extended around it. At each end of the house, amid the flowers of the garden, stationed the dove-cots were, as love's perpetual symbol, scenes of endless wooing and endless contentions of rivals. Silence reigned o'er the place. The line of shadow and sunshine ran near the tops of the trees, but the house itself was in shadow, and from its chimney top, ascending and slowly expanding into the evening air, a thin blue column of smoke rose. In the rear of the house, from the garden gate, ran a pathway through the great groves of oak to the skirts of the limitless prairie, into whose sea of flowers the sun was slowly descending, full in his track of light. Like ships with shadowy canvas hanging loose from their spars in a motionless calm in the tropics, stood a cluster of trees, with tangled cordage of grapevines, just where the woodlands met the flowery surf of the prairie. Mounted upon his horse, with Spanish saddle and stirrups, sat a herdsman, arrayed in gaiters and doublet of deerskin. Broad and brown was the face that from under the Spanish sombrero gazed on the peaceful scene, with the lordly look of its master. Round about him were numberless herds of kine that were grazing quietly in the meadows, and breathing the vapory freshness that uprose from the river and spread itself over the landscape. Slowly lifting the horn that hung at his side, and expanding fully his broad, deep chest, he blew a blast that resounded wildly and sweet and far through the still damp air of the evening. Suddenly out of the grass the long white horns of the cattle rose like flakes of foam on the adverse currents of ocean. Silent a moment they gazed, then bellowing rushed o'er the prairie, and the whole mass became a cloud, a shade in the distance. Then, as the herdsman turned to the house, through the gate of the garden saw he the forms of the priest and the maiden advancing to meet him. Suddenly down from his horse he sprang in amazement, and forward rushed with extended arms and exclamations of wonder. When they beheld his face, they recognized Basil the blacksmith. Hearty his welcome was, as he led his guests to the garden. There in an arbor of roses with endless question and answer gave they vent to their hearts, and renewed their friendly embraces, laughing and weeping by turns, or sitting silent and thoughtful, for Gabriel came not, and now dark doubts and misgivings stole o'er the maiden's heart, and Basil, somewhat embarrassed, broke the silence and said, "If you came by the Atchafalaya, how have you nowhere encountered my Gabriel's boat on the bayous?" Over Evangeline's face at the words of Basil a shade passed. Tears came into her eyes, and she said, with a tremulous accent, "Gone? Is Gabriel gone?" And, concealing her face on his shoulder, all her overburdened heart gave way, and she wept and lamented. Then the good Basil said, and his voice grew blithe as he said it, "Be of good cheer, my child, it is only today he departed. Foolish boy, he has left me alone with my herds and my horses." Moody and restless grown, and tried and troubled, his spirit could no longer endure the calm of this quiet existence, thinking ever of the uncertain and sorrowful, ever silent, or speaking only of the and his troubles. He at length had become so tedious to men and to maidens, tedious even to me, that at length I bethed me, and sent him unto the town of Adays to trade for mules with the Spaniards. Thence he will follow the Indian trails to the Ozark Mountains, hunting for furs in the forests, on rivers trapping the beaver. Therefore be of good cheer, we will follow the fugitive lover. He is not far on his way, and the fates and the streams are against him. Up and away tomorrow, and through the red dew of the morning we will follow him fast, and bring him back to his prison." Then glad voices were heard, and up from the banks of the river, borne aloft on his comrade's arms, came Michael the fiddler. Long under Basil's roof had he lived like a god on Olympus, having no other care than dispensing music to mortals. Far renowned was he for his silver locks and his fiddle. "Long live Michael," they cried, "our brave Acadian minstrel," as they bore him aloft in triumphal procession, and straightway Father Felician advanced with Evangeline, greeting the old man kindly and oft, and recalling recalling the past, while Basil, enraptured, hailed with hilarious joy his old companions and gossips, laughing loud and long, and embracing mothers and daughters. Much they marveled to see the wealth of the citizen blacksmith, all his domains and his herds, and his patriarchal demeanor. Much they marveled to hear his tales of the soil and the climate, and of the prairie, whose numberless herds were his who would take them. Each one thought in his heart that he, too, would go and do likewise. Thus they ascended the steps, and, crossing the breezy veranda, entered the hall of the house, where already the supper of Basil waited his late return, and they rested and feasted together. Over the joyous feast the sudden darkness descended. All was silent without, and, illuming the landscape with silver, fair rose the dewy moon and the myriad stars. But within doors, brighter than these, shone the faces of friends in the glimmering lamplight. Then from his station aloft, at the head of the table, the herdsman poured forth his heart and his wine together in endless profusion, lighting his pipe, that was filled with sweet Natchitoches tobacco. Thus he spake to his guests, who listened, and smiled as they listened. Welcome once more, my friends, who long have been friendless and homeless. Welcome once more to a home that is better perchance than the old one. Here no hungry winter congeals our blood like the rivers. Here no stony ground provokes the wrath of the farmer. Smoothly the plowshare runs through the soil as a keel through the water. All the year round the orange groves are in blossom, and grass grows more in a single night than the whole Canadian summer. Here, too, numberless herds run wild and unclaimed in the prairies. Here, too, lands may be had for the asking, and forests of timber with a few blows of the axe are hewn and framed into houses. After your houses are built and your fields are yellow with harvests, no King George of England shall drive you away from your homesteads, burning your dwellings and barns, and stealing your farms and your cattle. Speaking these words, he blew a wrathful cloud from his nostrils, while his huge, brown hand came thundering down on the table, so that the guests all started, and Father Felician, astounded, suddenly paused, with a pinch of snuff halfway to his nostrils. But the brave Basil resumed, and his words were milder and gayer. Only beware of the fever, my friends, beware of the fever, for it is not like that of our cold Acadian climate, cured by wearing a spider hung round one's neck in a nutshell. Then there were voices heard at the door, and footsteps approaching sounded upon the stairs and the floor of the breezy veranda. It was the neighboring Creoles and small Acadian planters, who had been summoned all to the house of Basil the herdsman. Merry the meeting was of ancient comrades and neighbors. Friend clasped friend in his arms, and they who before were as strangers, meeting in exile, became straightway as friends to each other, drawn by the gentle bond of a common country together. But in the neighboring hall a strain of music, proceeding from the accordant strings of Michael's melodious fiddle, broke up all further speech. Away, like children delighted, all things forgotten beside, they gave themselves to the maddening whirl of the dizzy dance, as it swept and swayed to the music, dreamlike, with beaming eyes and the rush of fluttering garments. Meanwhile, apart, at the head of the hall, the priest and the herdsman sat, conversing together of past and present and future, while Evangeline stood like one entranced. For within her olden memories rose, and loud in the midst of the music heard she the sound of the sea, and an irrepressible sadness came o'er her heart, and unseen she stole forth into the garden. Beautiful was the night. Behind the black wall of the forest, tipping its summit with silver, arose the moon. On the river fell here and there through the branches a tremulous gleam of the moonlight, like the sweet thoughts of love on a darkened and devious spirit. Near and round about her, the manifold flowers of the garden poured out their souls in odors that were their prayers and confessions unto the night as it went its way, like a silent Carthusian. Fuller of fragrance than they, and as heavy with shadows and night dews, hung the heart of the maiden. The calm and the magical moonlight seemed to inundate her soul with indefinable longing, as, through the garden gate, and beneath the shade of the oak trees, passed she along the path to the edge of the measureless prairie. Silent it lay, with a silvery haze upon it, and fireflies gleaming and floating away in mingled and infinite numbers. Over her head the stars, the thoughts of God in the heavens, shone on the eyes of man who had ceased to marvel and worship, save when a blazing comet was seen on the walls of that temple, as if a hand had appeared and written upon them, "Upharsin." And the soul of the maiden, between the stars and the fireflies, wandered alone, and she cried, "O Gabriel, O my beloved, art thou so near unto me, and yet I cannot behold thee? Art thou so near unto me, and yet thy voice does not reach me? Ah, how often thy feet have trod this path to the prairie. Ah, how often thine eyes have looked on the woodlands around me. Ah, how often beneath this oak, returning from labor, thou hast lain down to rest and to dream of me in thy slumbers. When shall these eyes behold, these arms be folded about thee?" Loud and sudden and near, the note of a whippoorwill sounded like a flute in the woods, and anon, through the neighboring thickets, farther and farther away it floated and dropped into silence. "Patience," whispered the oaks from oracular caverns of darkness, and, from the moonlit meadow, a sigh responded, "Tomorrow." Bright rose the sun next day, and all the flowers of the garden bathed his shining feet with their tears, and anointed his tresses with the delicious balm that they bore in their vases of crystal. "Farewell," said the priest, as he stood at the shadowy threshold. "See that you bring us the prodigal son from his fasting and famine." And, to the foolish virgin, who slept when the bridegroom was coming, "Farewell," answered the maiden, and, smiling, with Basil descended down to the river's brink, where the boatmen already were waiting, thus beginning their journey with morning and sunshine and gladness. Swiftly they followed the flight of him who was speeding before them, blown by the blast of fate like a dead leaf over the desert. Not that day, nor the next, nor yet the day that succeeded, found they trace of his course in lake or forest or river, nor after many days had they found him, but vague and uncertain rumors alone were their guides through a wild and desolate country, till at the little inn of the Spanish town of a days, weary and worn, they alighted, and learned from the garrulous landlord that on the day before, with horses and guides and companions, Gabriel left the village and took the road of the prairies. 4. Far in the west there lies a desert land, where the mountains lift, through perpetual snows, their lofty and luminous summits, down from their jagged, deep ravines, where the gorge, like a gateway, opens a passage route to the wheels of the emigrant's wagon. Westward the Oregon flows and the Walway and Oe, eastward, with devious course, among the Wind River Mountains, through the Sweetwater Valley precipitate leaps the Nebraska, and to the south, from Fontaine Quai Bout and the Spanish Sierras, fretted with sands and rocks, and swept by the wind of the desert, numberless torrents, with ceaseless sound, descend to the ocean, like the great chords of a harp, in loud and solemn vibrations. Spreading between these streams are the wondrous, beautiful prairies, billowy bays of grass ever rolling in shadow and sunshine, bright with luxuriant clusters of roses and purple amorphous. Over them wandered the buffalo herds, and the elk and the roebuck. Over them wandered the wolves, and herds of riderless horses, fires that blast and blight, and winds that are weary with travel. Over them wander the scattered tribes of Ishmael's children, staining the desert with blood, and above their terrible war trails circles and sails aloft, on pinions majestic, the vulture, like the implacable soul of a chieftain slaughtered in battle, by invisible stairs ascending and scaling the heavens. Here and there rise smokes from the camps of these savage marauders. Here and there rise groves from the margins of swift-running rivers, and the grim, taciturn bear, the anchorite monk of the desert, climbs down their dark ravines to dig for roots by the brook side, and over all is the sky, the clear and crystalline heaven, like the protecting hand of God inverted above them. Into this wonderful land, at the base of the Ozark Mountains, Gabriel Farr had entered, with hunters and trappers behind him. Day after day, with their Indian guides, the maiden and Basil followed his flying steps, and thought each day to overtake him. Sometimes they saw, or thought they saw, the smoke of his campfire rise in the morning air from the distant plain. But at nightfall, when they had reached the place, they found only embers and ashes. And, though their hearts were sad at times and their bodies were weary, hope still guided them on, as the magic Fata Morgana showed them her lakes of light that retreated and vanished before them. Once, as they sat by their evening fire, there silently entered into the little camp an Indian woman, whose features wore deep traces of sorrow and patience as great as her sorrow. She was a Shawnee woman returning home to her people from the far-off hunting grounds of the cruel Comanches, where her Canadian husband, a Cowerde stray boys had been murdered. Touched were their hearts at her story, and warmest and friendliest welcome gave they with words of cheer, and she sat and feasted among them on the buffalo meat and the venison cooked on the embers. But when their meal was done, and Basil and all his companions, worn with the long day's march and the chase of the deer and the bison, stretched themselves on the ground, and slept where the quivering firelight flashed on their swarthy cheeks, and their forms wrapped up in their blankets, then at the door of Evangeline's tent she sat and repeated slowly, with soft, low voice, and the charm of her Indian accent, all the tale of her love, with its pleasures, and pains, and reverses. Much Evangeline wept at the tale, and to know that another hapless heart like her own had loved and had been disappointed, moved to the depths of her soul by pity and woman's compassion, yet in her sorrow pleased that one who had suffered was near her. She in turn related her love and all its disasters. Mute with wonder the Shawnee sat, and when she had ended still was mute, but at length, as if a mysterious horror passed through her brain, she spake, and repeated the tale of the Moses, the bridegroom of snow, who won and wedded a maiden, but when the morning came, arose and passed from the wigwam, fading and melting away and dissolving into the sunshine, till she beheld him no more, though she followed far into the forest. Then, in those sweet, low tones that seemed like a weird incantation, told she the tale of the fair Lilinow, who was wooed by a phantom that, through the pines o'er her father's lodge, in the hush of the twilight, breathed like the evening wind, and whispered love to the maiden, till she followed his green and waving plume through the forest, and never more returned, nor was seen again by her people. Silent with wonder and strange surprise, Evangeline listened to the soft flow of her magical words, till the region around her seemed like enchanted ground, and her swarthy guest the enchantress. Slowly over the tops of the Ozark Mountains the moon rose, lighting the little tent, and with a mysterious splendor touching the somber leaves, and embracing and filling the woodland. With a delicious sound the brook rushed by, and the branches swayed and sighed overhead in scarcely audible whispers. Filled with the thoughts of love was Evangeline's heart, but a secret, subtle sense crept in of pain and indefinite terror, as the cold, poisonous snake creeps into the nest of the swallow. It was no earthly fear. A breath from the region of spirits seemed to float in the air of night, and she felt for a moment that, like the Indian maid, she, too, was pursuing a phantom. With this thought she slept, and the fear and the phantom had vanished. Early upon the morrow the march was resumed, and the Shawnee said, as they journeyed along, on the western slope of these mountains dwells in his little village the black-robed chief of the mission. Much he teaches the people, and tells them of Mary and Jesus. Loud laugh their hearts with joy, and weep with pain, as they hear him. Then, with a sudden and secret emotion, Evangeline answered, "Let us go to the mission, for there good tidings await us." Thither they turned their steeds, and behind a spur of the mountains, just as the sun went down, they heard a murmur of voices, and in a meadow green and broad, by the bank of a river, saw the tents of the Christians, the tents of the Jesuit mission. Under a towering oak that stood in the midst of the village, knelt the black-robed chief with his children, a crucifix fastened high on the trunk of the tree, and overshadowed by grapevines, looked with its agonized face on the multitude kneeling beneath it. This was their rural chapel. Aloft, through the intricate arches of its aerial roof, arose the chant of their vespers, mingling its notes with the soft susurrus and sighs of the branches. Silent, with heads uncovered, the travelers, nearer approaching, knelt on the swarded floor and joined in the evening devotions. But when the service was done, and the benediction had fallen forth from the hands of the priest, like seed from the hands of the sower, slowly the reverend man advanced to the strangers, and bade them welcome, and when they replied, he smiled with benignant expression, hearing the home-like sounds of his mother tongue in the forest, and, with words of kindness, conducted them into his wigwam. There upon mats and skins they reposed, and on cakes of the maize ear feasted, and slaked their thirst from the water gourd of the teacher. Soon was their story told, and the priest with solemnity answered, "Not 6 sons have risen and set since Gabriel, seated on this mat by my side, where now the maiden reposes, told me this same sad tale." Then arose and continued his journey. Soft was the voice of the priest, and he spake with an accent of kindness, but on Evangeline's heart fell his words as in winter the snowflakes fall into some lone nest from which the birds have departed. Far to the north he has gone, continued the priest, but in autumn, when the chase is done, will return again to the mission. Then Evangeline said, and her voice was meek and submissive, let me remain with thee, for my soul is sad and afflicted. So seemed it wise and well unto all, and Beddoes on the morrow, mounting his Mexican steed, with his Indian guides and companions, homeward Basil returned, and Evangeline stayed at the mission. Slowly, slowly, slowly the days succeeded each other, days and weeks and months, and the fields of maize that were springing green from the ground when a stranger she came, now waving above her, lifted their slender shafts, with leaves interlacing, and forming cloisters for mendicant crows and granaries pillaged by squirrels. Then in the golden weather the maize was husked, and the maidens blushed at each blood-red ear, for that Bedekined a lover, but at the crooked laughed, and called it a thief in the cornfield. Even the blood-red ear to Evangeline brought not her lover. Patience, the priest would say, have faith, and thy prayer will be answered. Look at this vigorous plant that lifts its head from the meadow. See how its leaves are turned to the north, as true as the magnet. This is the compass flower that the finger of God has planted here in the houseless wild, to direct the traveler's journey over the sea-like, pathless, limitless waste of the desert. Such in the soul of man is faith. The blossoms of passion, gay and luxuriant flowers, are brighter and fuller of fragrance, but they beguile us, and lead us astray, and their odor is deadly. Only this humble plant can guide us here, and hereafter crown us with asphodel flowers, that are wet with the dews of Nepenthe. So came the autumn, and passed, and the winter, yet Gabriel came not. Blossomed the opening spring, and the notes of the robin and bluebird sounded sweet upon wold and in wood, yet Gabriel came not. But on the breath of the summer winds a rumor was wafted, sweeter than song of bird, or hue or odor of blossom. Far to the north and east, it said, in the Michigan forests, Gabriel had his lodge by the banks of the Saginaw River, and, with returning guides that sought the lakes of St. Lawrence, saying a sad farewell, Evangeline went from the mission. When over weary ways, by long and perilous marches, she had attained at length the depths of the Michigan forests, found she the hunter's lodge deserted and fallen to ruin. Thus did the long sad years glide on, and in seasons and places divers and distant far was seen the wandering maiden, now in the tents of grace of the meek Moravian missions, now in the noisy camps and the battlefields of the army, now in secluded hamlets, in towns and populous cities. Like a phantom she came, and passed away unremembered. Fair was she and young, when in hope began the long journey. Faded was she and old, when in disappointment it ended. Each succeeding year stole something away from her beauty, leaving behind it, broader and deeper, the gloom and the shadow. Then there appeared and spread faint streaks of gray o'er her forehead, dawn of another life, that broke o'er her earthly horizon, as in the eastern sky the first faint streaks of the morning. 5. In that delightful land which is washed by the Delaware's waters, guarding in sylvan shades the name of Penn the Apostle, stands on the banks of its beautiful stream the city he founded. There all the air is balm, and the peach is the emblem of beauty, and the streets still re-echo the names of the trees of the forest, as if they fain would appease the dryads whose haunts they molested. There from the troubled sea had Evangeline landed, an exile, finding among the children of Penn a home and a country. There old René Leblanc had died, and when he departed, saw at his side only one of all his 100 descendants. Something at least there was in the friendly streets of the city, something that spake to her heart and made her no longer a stranger, and her ear was pleased with the and thou of the Quakers, for it recalled the past, the old Acadian country, where all men were equal and all were brothers and sisters. So when the fruitless search, the disappointed endeavor ended, to recommence no more upon earth, uncomplaining, thither as leaves to the light were turned her thoughts and her footsteps. As from a mountain's top the rainy mists of the morning roll away, and afar we behold the landscape below us, sun-illumined, with shining rivers and cities and hamlets, so fell the mists from her mind, and she saw the world far below her, dark no longer, but all illumined with love, and the pathway which she had climbed so far, lying smooth and fair in the distance. Gabriel was not forgotten. Within her heart was his image, clothed in the beauty of love and youth, as last she beheld him, only more beautiful, made by his death-like silence and absence. Into her thoughts of him time entered not, for it was not. Over him years had no power. He was not changed, but transfigured. He had become to her heart as one who is dead, and not absent. Patience and abnegation of self, and devotion to others. This was the lesson a life of trial and sorrow had taught her. So was her love diffused, but, like tessimodorous spices, suffered no waste nor loss, though filling the air with aroma. Other hope had she none, nor wish in life, but to follow meekly with reverent steps the sacred feet of her Savior. Thus many years she lived as a sister of mercy, frequenting lonely and wretched roofs in the crowded lanes of the city, where distress and want concealed themselves from the sunlight, where disease and sorrow in garrets languished neglected. Night after night, when the world was asleep, as the watchman repeated loud, through the gusty streets, that all was well in the city, high at some lonely window he saw the light of her taper. Day after day, in the grey of the dawn, as slow through the suburbs plodded the German farmer, with flowers and fruits for the market, met he that meek, pale face, returning home from its watchings. Then it came to pass that a pestilence fell on the city, presaged by wondrous signs, and mostly by flocks of wild pigeons, darkening the sun in their flight, with naught in their craws but an acorn. And, as the tides of the sea arise in the month of September, flooding some silver stream, till it spreads to a lake in the meadow, so death flooded life, and, overflowing its natural margin, spread to a brackish lake, the silver stream of existence. Wealth had no power to bribe, nor beauty to charm the oppressor, but all perished alike beneath the scourge of his anger. Only, alas, the poor, who had neither friends nor attendants, crept away to die in the almshouse, home of the homeless. Then in the suburbs it stood, in the midst of meadows and woodlands. Now the city surrounds it, but still, with its gateway and wicket, meek, in the midst of splendor, its humble walls seem to echo softly the words of the Lord. The poor ye always have with you. Thither, by night and by day, came the sister of mercy. The dying looked up into her face, and thought, indeed, to behold there gleams of celestial light encircle her forehead with splendor, such as the artist paints o'er the brows of saints and apostles, or such as hangs by night o'er a city seen at a distance. Unto their eyes it seemed the lamps of the city celestial, into whose shining gates erelong their spirits would enter. Thus, on the Sabbath morn, through the streets, deserted and silent, wending her quiet way, she entered the door of the almshouse. Sweet on the summer air was the odor of flowers in the garden, and she paused on her way to gather the fairest among them, that the dying once more might rejoice in their fragrance and beauty. Then, as she mounted the stairs to the corridors, cooled by the east wind, distant and soft on her ear fell the chimes from the belfry of Christ Church, while, intermingled with these, across the meadows were wafted sounds of psalms that were sung by the Swedes in their church at Wicaco. Soft as descending wings fell the calm of the hour on her spirit. Something within her said, "At length thy trials are ended." And, with light in her looks, she entered the chambers of sickness, noiselessly moved about the assiduous, careful attendants, moistening the feverish lip and the aching brow, and in silence closing the sightless eyes of the dead, and concealing their faces, where on their pallets they lay, like drifts of snow by the roadside. Many a languid head, upraised as Evangeline entered, turned on its pillow of pain to gaze while she passed, for her presence fell on their hearts like a ray of the sun on the walls of a prison. And, as she looked around, she saw how Death, the consoler, laying his hand upon many a heart, had healed it forever. Many familiar forms had disappeared in the night time. Vacant their places were, or filled already by strangers. Suddenly, as if arrested by fear, a feeling of wonder, still she stood, with her colorless lips apart, while a shudder ran through her frame, and, forgotten, the flowers dropped from her fingers, and from her eyes and cheeks the light and bloom of the morning. Then there escaped from her lips a cry of such terrible anguish, that the dying heard it, and started up from their pillows. On the pallet before her was stretched the form of an old man. Long and thin and gray were the locks that shaded his temples, but, as he lay in the morning light, his face for a moment seemed to assume once more the forms of its earlier manhood. So are wont to be changed the faces of those who are dying. Hot and red on his lips still burned the flush of the fever, as if life, like the Hebrew, with blood had besprinkled its portals, that the angel of death might see the sign, and pass over. Motionless, senseless, dying he lay, and his spirit exhausted seemed to be sinking down through infinite depths in the darkness of slumber and death, forever sinking and sinking. Then through those realms of shade and multiplied reverberations heard he that cry of pain, and through the hush that succeeded whispered a gentle voice in accents tender and saint-like, "Gabriel, O my beloved," and died away into silence. Then he beheld in a dream once more the home of his childhood, green Acadian meadows with sylvan rivers among them, village and mountain and woodlands, and, walking under their shadow as in the days of her youth, Evangeline rose in his vision. Tears came into his eyes, and as slowly he lifted his eyelids, vanished the vision away. But Evangeline knelt by his bedside. Vainly he strove to whisper her name, for the accents unuttered died on his lips, and their motion revealed what his tongue would have spoken. Vainly he strove to rise, and Evangeline, kneeling beside him, kissed his dying lips, and laid his head on her bosom. Sweet was the light of his eyes, but it suddenly sank into darkness, as when a lamp is blown out by a gust of wind at a casement. All was ended now, the hope and the fear and the sorrow, all the aching of heart, the restless, unsatisfied longing, all the dull, deep pain and constant anguish of patience, and, as she pressed once more the lifeless head to her bosom, meekly she bowed her own, and murmured, "Father, I thank thee." Still stands the forest primeval, but far away from its shadow, side by side, in their nameless graves, the lovers are sleeping. Under the humble walls of the little Catholic churchyard, in the heart of the city, they lie unknown and unnoticed. Daily the tides of life go ebbing and flowing beside them. Thousands of throbbing hearts, where theirs are at rest and forever. Thousands of aching brains, where theirs no longer are busy. Thousands of toiling hands, where theirs have ceased from their labors. Thousands of weary feet, where theirs have completed their journey. Still stands the forest primeval, but under the shade of its branches dwells another race, with other customs and language. Only along the shore of the mournful and misty Atlantic linger a few Acadian peasants, whose fathers from exile wandered back to their native land to die in its bosom. In the fisherman's cot the wheel and the loom are still busy. Maidens still wear their Norman caps and their kirtles of homespun, and by the evening fire repeat Evangeline's story, while from its rocky caverns the deep-voiced neighboring ocean speaks, and in accents disconsolate answers the wail of the forest.